Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I don't speak Dutch. We Brits have our limitations at times. But I'm going to ask you very bluntly tonight, have we taken leave of our senses over the Middle East? I have a prime minister at the moment who's trying to persuade the British to bomb ISIS in Syria. Actually, the battle in the House of Commons in London is whether to bomb Mr. Corbyn out of the Labour leadership. The Syrians are going to be the, quote, collateral damage for this. Yes, be cynical. It is cynical. But I suppose, coming from the Middle East directly, I'm amazed to see a Europe that I used many years ago, many decades ago, to live in, which is also taking leave of its senses. I arrive here to find that France is at war. Even that Belgians think they are at war. With a criminal conspiracy after a criminal atrocity, we are told that Paris or France has changed forever. Now, I can believe that the German occupation of 1940 and Pétain and Vichy changed France forever. But this atrocity, no. I can believe in Belgium that World War II and the occupation and Léon de Grelle changed you forever. But this is not World War II, and this is not a war. It is something quite different. And I'm going to admit to you that ever since 4 weeks ago, I started back from the Middle East again to give some lectures in Canada, from Queen Victoria Island and Vancouver to Quebec and Montreal. For the very first time, after 39 years in the Middle East, it'll be 40 on June the 6th, fatal date next year, I am at a loss to understand the nature of the titanic events which are taking place around me when I go to Egypt and to Syria, and of course I live in Lebanon. I ask myself, you know, you here I think are on now the level 3 of danger, or level 4, or red zone, or whatever it is in Paris, or purple zone in the United States. I live in a part of the world where every city is permanently on purple alert, where we are on series 10 of alerts. So I come back to Europe and I ask, what is going on here? You know, 100 years ago, almost to the day, Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Georges-François Picot, the British and French diplomats, met in secret to divide up the Middle East at the height of the First World War. And of course, we know what happened. Mr. Sykes wanted to make sure that Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq remained in British hands, and the French, Monsieur Picot, wanted to make sure that Syria, Lebanon, and at that stage, northern Iraq would be in French hands. We divvied up the Middle East. Interestingly, when the First World War ended, the missionaries, who were the NGOs of their time in the Middle East, all put forward the idea of one Arab nation from the Atlantic, Morocco, to the border of Mesopotamia and Persia, Iraq and Iran. And so did the State Department diplomats from the dying Ottoman Empire. But of course, the British and French had decided that they wanted these territories, and they took them. And in the 100 years since, the Arabs of these regions had no freedom, no dignity, no justice. Always we go to the Middle East with our tanks and our armored vehicles and our Apache helicopters, or our swords and our horses, offering democracy to the Arab Muslims. But I noticed in Tahrir Square in 2011, nobody carried a poster demanding demokratia. They asked for justice, dignity, and freedom, but they didn't ask for democracy. And there's a clear reason why not, because for the Arabs of the Middle East, democracy was a word they associated immediately and understandably with our Western nations, which had spent 100 years propping up, paying and arming the kings and generals and dictators whom we delivered unto them to oppress them and torture them. So democracy was not a word that any Arab I ever met wanted to hear to be given as a gift to their countries. Democracies had supported the Mubaraks and the Saddams for a long time. The Americans supported Saddam when he invaded Iran. It was only when he invaded the wrong country, Kuwait, that we decided that he was as bad as Hitler. And we supported Gaddafi at the beginning. The British Foreign Office loved Gaddafi. Then he helped the IRA, so we hated him. Then we decided he was part of the war on terror. Then Tony Blair went and kissed Gaddafi, and we loved him again. Then he invaded Benghazi and tried to kill his own people, and we hated him again. Don't be a dictator in the Middle East, whatever you're thinking of in the future. But let's just remember, for the Arabs, democracy was the word they associated with the support for their dictatorships. That's why I do not call it an Arab Spring. This was a Hollywood State Department invention. I called it the Arab Awakening, using the title of George Antonius's great book on the original British betrayal of the Arab Revolt, or perhaps the Arab Revolutions. But dignity and justice was what people asked for. Two commodities which we had no intention of giving the people of the Middle East. It's strange, you know, how ideas come up out of the blue when everything is going wrong. I remember by 2005, I was visiting military bases in southern Iraq, and one evening, a huge man who introduced himself to me as a member of the agency, you know, CIA, obviously, huge pistol. Bob, what went wrong? And I said, well, 2 years after your invasion, you might at least have set up a giant hospital outside Baghdad for the poor and hungry masses. But I said, have you ever thought of the Roman Empire? I wasn't recommending crucifixion. I said that for the Romans, everyone outside the empire was a barbarian. But once they had conquered the barbarians, everyone inside those borders became citizens of Rome. I said, if Mr. Bush or Mr. Blair had offered the Iraqis citizenship of America and Britain, they wouldn't have all rushed to JFK or Heathrow Airport, but they would have realized that we loved them, but we didn't. We didn't care about them. I think we cared about their land and their oil. If Iraq had been, the gross national product of Iraq had been asparagus, do you really think we would have invaded Iraq? No, you don't, do you? In 2003. Let's go back to Sykes-Picot, because you see, the first video that was put out by ISIS, not these slick, sick execution videos. By the way, I have to watch them all. I see the beheadings and the drownings. It's appalling. But before they went in for this kind of slick Hollywood-style viciousness, ISIS produced a video for the Middle East. I saw it when I was in Beirut. I don't think you would have seen it in Europe. It was very crude. It was a handheld camera, and it showed a bulldozer knocking down a rampart of sand. It was the border between Iraq and Syria, and the camera panned down and caught a little piece of paper lying on the sand, and written in biro in English was, "End of Sykes-Picot." That evening, by chance, I was having dinner with Walid Jumblat, the Lebanese Druze leader, and he stood on the doorsteps, "Robert, it is the end of Sykes-Picot." I said, "Oh, come on, Walid, rubbish." But Walid was right, and I was wrong, because what I think, looking back now, and I'm not trying to be a prophet or a seer, because my crystal ball broke a long time ago in the Middle East, but looking back now, I think that 2011 and the Arab revolutions were not just an attempt to get rid of dictators and say, this is our land, though it certainly was. I think that the Arab peoples had given up on the institutionalized systems which we, the British and the French and the West, had given them, imposed on them, and forced them to undergo since 1915. They rejected the fake governments and the false elections which we allowed them to have by supporting their dictators. They rejected the false newspapers. They rejected the frontiers. When the Syrian refugees poured away, initially from the dictatorship and the cruelty of Bashar al-Assad, and then from Nusra, and then from ISIS, and then just from the destruction of their cities, they walked across the border into Lebanon. I saw them, I live in Lebanon, and into Jordan, and into Turkey, without the slightest regard to the frontier fence. And their distaste for frontiers became evident to me in July of this year, when I was supposed to be covering the Greek economic crisis, but I went with Médecins Sans Frontières up to the Greek-Macedonian border. This is before the hundreds of thousands of Muslims suddenly appeared in Europe. And I saw hundreds and then thousands of Iraqis and Syrians walking like an army of the poor, a medieval army, out of the cornfields of northern Greece with bruises from the Macedonian frontier guards. Two of them from Aleppo, I knew they were brothers. I'd met them in wartime Aleppo 2 years earlier. And he said, Mr. Robert, we're going to Germany. And I said, how can you get? We are going to Germany. To hell with the frontiers. And they started speaking about Syria and their citizenship of Syria in the past tense. You see, they had already dispensed with Sykes-Picot. They no longer believed in the institutions and the frontiers which we laid down for them, and now they did not respect our frontiers either. And they did walk to Germany, or were given trains at the end of their journey in Austria or in Serbia or in Croatia to go to Germany. They broke down our frontiers in the same way as they no longer believed in theirs. What we are seeing in this extraordinary, again, I use that word, titanic, epic piece of history, and this mass ingress of refugees, they are not just afflicted by war, but they've been afflicted by our history to them. And this is part of the collapse of Sykes-Picot. And we should realize that. They now ignore our frontiers too. ISIS, I think, must have been appalled. We want to beat ISIS. We want to bomb ISIS. No, ISIS was defeated by the very vast crowds of refugees whom we began to fear. Put up the borders, more police, more passport controls. ISIS would have asked themselves, must have asked themselves, why didn't these hundreds of thousands of Muslims come to our wonderful caliphate? They didn't. They went to Europe, to us. And can you imagine the anger of ISIS when the Germans showed them love instead of hatred? Now that was our defeat of ISIS. Stronger, more potent, more powerful than any bomb that any airplane can drop on Raqqa. And I keep saying to myself, and I'm the son of a soldier who fought in the First World War as well as the Second. He was in the civil defense in the Second, but my dad was in the Third Battle of the Somme. I found myself saying, thank God for Germany. Angela Merkel, who appears to some of us an angel, actually was the only one who, instead of speaking of our values as something to be attacked by ISIS, as Monsieur Hollande has done and as Mr. Cameron endlessly does, she spoke of our values as being in danger if we did not receive these poor refugees. She got the EU right, and we're still trying to fight for it with bombs. Where do you go from here? No wonder they attacked Paris. ISIS want to destroy us. But they're not going to do it by just bringing us on with bombs. They want that to happen. They want the French elite to turn against the Muslims of France, particularly those of Algerian origin, in civil war. That's why they bombed Paris. That's why Hollande should never have said he was at war. These were criminals. The moment you say you're at war, you turn them into vicious warriors. They want ISIS to start a civil war in France. They'd like a war in Belgium. They'd like massive racism against Muslims in Britain. They want to destroy the EU. They would like to destroy the Schengen area. And they've already managed to achieve a bit of that courtesy of France. Now when you get your train from Bruxelles Midi, you have to go through an extra control, courtesy of ISIS. Are we helping them? I ask myself sometimes. Maybe it's because I live in the Middle East. Maybe it's because, in some strange way, when I cross the Atlantic to talk in America or Canada, it's like I go through a glass darkly, to quote the King James Version of the English Bible. Something happens, and when I get to the Canadian border, I get to the United States, the Middle East I read about and hear about and listen to isn't the Middle East I've flown from. And now I wonder, in Beirut, whether the Europe I'm traveling to is the Europe I know. 3-4 weeks ago, I had to speak at an economic conference at Banff. Oh, there were huge numbers of bankers, oil men boasting of their fracking for oil. There were CEOs from BP, and all number of immensely wealthy and expensive CEOs and bankers and asset managers and other people of that ilk. And I tried to explain to them if they'd like to hear the newspaper version of what's going on in the Middle East. I said to them, I'd like to tell you what's going on in the Middle East. So a few of them brought out their pens. So I said, how about this? The Americans, this is a quotation from what I said in Banff. The Americans and the British and the Canadians are bombing ISIS and Nusra in Iraq. The Canadians have stopped, by the way. Nusra, of course, is partial to Al-Qaeda. The Americans and the British and the Canadians are bombing ISIS and Nusra in Syria. The British are now going to bomb them on their own as well. We were going to bomb Bashar al-Assad's Syrian army in Syria, but now we're bombing his enemies, but not in such a way that it will help the Syrian army. The Syrian army is bombing and shelling ISIS and Nusra in Syria. The Lebanese Hezbollah is fighting ISIS and Nusra in Syria, and Iran is bombing ISIS and Nusra in Syria and in Iraq. So we're allies of Iran in Iraq, but enemies of Iran in Syria. The Turks are bombing ISIS in Syria, but mostly the Kurds in Syria and Turkey. Meanwhile, the Jordanians and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris are also bombing ISIS in Iraq and sometimes in Syria, but not perhaps Nusra, which is part of Al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, the Saudis and the Emiratis are bombing Yemen, and the Yemenis are shelling Saudi Arabia, and the Egyptian and Qataris are bombing Libya, and the Israelis have been bombing the Syrian army and the Iranians in Syria, but not bombing ISIS or Nusra in Syria or anywhere else. Ladies and gentlemen, I finished at Banff. I trust I make myself obscure. This is not statesmanship, ladies and gentlemen. This is infantile. So what can we do now? I hate this question because I always say, go back to history and find out how it happened and learn from now how it's going to happen again. For example, we have in Uzbekistan a dictator whom we are supporting militarily and politically, a chief advisor to the dictator who boils his torture victims in boiling water, is Tony Blair. In 10 years' time, this wretched man is going to invade Tajikistan or some other of the stans, and we will say, he's worse than Saddam and Hitler, and we'll have to have boots on the ground, and we'll invade him, and we'll have House of Commons, and we'll be at war. We can't go on like this. So what do we need? I think some kind of new institutions in the world. I suppose, excuse me, the nearest we've got to it at the moment is the Climate Change Conference in Paris, but my mind goes back to San Francisco Conference of 1945, which set up the United Nations, whose principal objective was to make sure that the world never went to war again, and by and large, with all its faults, it succeeded. But at San Francisco, the politicians, or the statesmen, if you like, they weren't working to that night's press conference, tonight's TV special, to the next Twitter message from politicians. They knew that the fruits of what they were trying to put together would not be benefited from until they were dead and in their graves of old age. They were looking forward as our politicians used to look forward in the age when we prepared for the future, not for the 6 p.m. news. Interestingly, Winston Churchill, a man who's not my greatest hero, Churchill in 1941 in the spring set up a cabinet committee in Whitehall, in Downing Street, to plan the occupation by the Allies of post-war occupied Nazi Germany. This is before Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The next year, 42, before the Battle of El Alamein, before Stalingrad, Cambridge University in England began a graduate course for British civil servants to learn how to run occupied Nazi Germany when the Allies had won. Now, this was a man, again, Churchill is not a great hero. My PhD at Trinity College Dublin was in Irish neutrality, and I learned more about Churchill and his betrayal of the Irish than I needed to know. But Churchill was a man who thought of the future and dared to think of it against the impossible odds that we might win. And there was a plan. The first British soldiers to enter Köln, which was the major German city in Western Germany, to be liberated. The Russians, of course, were coming into Eastern Germany. When they went into the Rathaus, the municipality town hall in Cologne, British civil servants in steel helmets went with them, and under fire were setting up the administration of the new Germany, the new free and democratic Germany. And yet when American tanks crossed the Tigris River in 2003, they didn't even know what they were going to do tomorrow. We don't plan. We have no major new institutional ideas. And our politicians today, alas, it's not their fault, have never experienced war. They think it's an adventure. They think it's like Hollywood. It's about winning or losing. When, in fact, war, as those earlier ministers whom you had and the French had, who'd been in the First War as well as the Second, they knew that war was about death, the final destruction of the human spirit. The failure of the human spirit is what war is about. We've lost that lesson. So we don't think in large horizon terms about the future. Look what happened after the First World War. There was a tide of millions of refugees from Russia, post-revolution, and from the Middle East, the millions of Armenians who escaped their own Holocaust genocide of 1915. Many of them were coming from Aleppo into Europe. The League of Nations asked Fridtjof Nansen, the great Norwegian Arctic explorer, to take care of refugees, and he invented the Nansen passport, a passport for refugees which was fully diplomatically recognized by 50 nations, many of them in Europe. So the refugees from the Middle East had their own documentation, not of the country of origin, unless they kept their old passports, but they had a passport saying, I am a Russian, I am Armenian, I am an Ottoman, I am an Iraqi, and it was accepted because it was a Nansen passport. Nobody has looked back or even mentioned Nansen in the context of today's refugee torment. These people need that kind of initiative. They need that kind of major political, diplomatic initiative, and it is totally lacking. Even tonight, I hear from my office, the Tories are planning the vote to coincide with the 11 p.m. news in Britain, or the 10 p.m. major news in Britain. So still, we're allowing the public relations, and by the way, remember, David Cameron's profession is public relations. He wasn't even a lawyer like our friend Tony Blair. By the way, if anyone can understand this Tony Blair, you get 10 euros later on tonight. The man, you would have thought with his close relationship with God, that God occasionally gave him some advice. You know, like, don't invade Iraq, Tony. It may not be a good idea. However, we are dealing with politicians and statesmen today who are eyeing only their Twitter accounts, the television times, the news press conference, and how to out-cliche the rest. Where did David Cameron get 70,000 moderate fighters in Syria? 700 maybe, 70 quite probably, but 70,000. This is a prime minister, my own, who photoshopped a fake poppy onto his lapel to honor our war dead from World War I and World War II. Now he's photoshopping 70,000 moderates onto the map of Syria. You know, the Syrian army will tell you, if you talk to them, they don't care about the moderates, they run away. They have to fight ISIS and Nusra, and that is the enemy. So why don't we plan? I think basically because I'm writing the new book, companion volume to the book that was published here 10 years ago, I think about previous episodes in history. The Armenian genocide itself, 1.5 million dead, deportation, massacre, rape, not totally unlike ISIS. And it took place in the very location where ISIS now rules. When in 1994, I went to the area of desert in northern Syria where the Armenians died in their tens of thousands at the hands of the Turks. By that stage, mostly women and children. I found bones in a riverbed of the Armenians with rags on some of the bones that were buried in a hillside. They had been tied together before they'd been killed. And I took those bones to the church of Deir ez-Zor in Syria, which was the Armenian church of memory to the Holocaust. Nusra, whom the Qatar is now trying to say are our moderates, Nusra went into that church, dynamited, took all the bones, not just the few that I had collected, but all the others collected since the Armenian genocide, and threw them into the street. These things are not new in our history. If you think of Bosnia, which I'm writing about now, because I covered the Bosnia and Kosovo wars, the 250,000 dead, most of them Muslims, the mass rape of Muslim women, and I met the women who recounted this horror to me. This is not unlike ISIS, although in that occasion, of course, they were Serb Christians who were doing these filthy deeds, not Muslims like ISIS. So this is not The phenomenon of ISIS is not new in terms of horror. We've done it too, and so have the Turks. Just think of their current situation. And they won't even admit the Armenian genocide. What is happening in Syria at the moment? Well, yes, the Russians are there. And they are trying to give the Syrian army some victories. Not terribly successfully, because ISIS and Nusra are managing to capture some villages on the main highway between Aleppo, Homs, Hama, and Damascus, in an attempt, I'm sure, to bring the Russian ground troops in. They haven't come yet. And if Mr. Putin is wise, and I'm not sure if he is, he won't send them there. But you see, the question we keep asking about, okay, can Assad survive? Possibly. With Russia? Maybe. Can the Syrian army survive? Well, they may be the future rulers of Syria. Stop thinking about Bashar al-Assad and ask yourself whether an army that has a secret figure, but I know it, suffered 60,000 dead in the military, the government regime army, are they going to let, after that sacrifice, are they going to let their country go back to the Ba'ath Party and Bashar al-Assad? I doubt it. Not that simply and not that easily. But let's go back for a moment to ISIS. What is ISIS? I used to call it a cult, also an army of lost souls. The cult phrase was taken up later by David Cameron, so I hope he didn't get it from me, but I've begun to think differently about ISIS. You know, I think what they try to do is to find something in us which is different to what we think we are. They search out for something in the excitement that we have in drama and tragedy. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In Lebanon, when the civil war ended, many people, including my landlord, I noticed they became depressed. The excitement had gone out of their life. Life wasn't so interesting anymore because it was no longer dangerous. And I think that there's a grave danger among many people in the West today to live a kind of two lives, especially if you are of Muslim origin from the Middle East. Many of the 9/11 hijackers, 15 of whom were Saudis, by the way, I'll come back to that in a moment, many of them began to hate themselves and feel corrupted when they were living in the West and enjoying our freedoms. Our freedoms to go out to a party, to drink alcohol, to have relationships which they wouldn't be able to have in the Middle East. And many of them went back to the Middle East and felt, I suspect, corrupted in themselves. The two sides of themselves began to jostle together. About 2 years ago, I think it was Avignon, but it may have been Perpignan in France, a young woman, French woman of Muslim origin, left her home. And her parents, Algerian origin parents, called the police. They feared, alas, correctly, that she'd gone to Syria. She had indeed, and they didn't manage to stop her. But when the police arrived, they looked at the young woman's Facebook. She had two Facebooks. One of the Facebooks was about parties, music, going out. The other Facebook had a picture of the ruins of Aleppo. On the top in Arabic, Bismillah, Allah, Muhammad al-Rasul-Allah. And then in French, I am ready to be a martyr to save the women and children of Aleppo. And the French police question, as of course adumbrated in the French press, which was the real Facebook? Which was it, ladies and gentlemen? The first or the second? The first? I've got one or two people who got it right. They were both the real Facebook. That's how ISIS does it. They're appealing directly to the heart of the person, not just to that bit. They're appealing to them as a whole person who is divided. And what is ISIS when you look at it? Now, when you look at these ISIS videos, as I told you I have to, one of the things about them is that they lack emotion. When they filmed the vicious, cruel atrocity of burning alive their captured Jordanian pilot, they used 7 different camera angles to film his agony as the oil burning flowed into the cage and immolated him. Hollywood uses 4, occasionally 5 camera angles on a major scene. They use 7. When they suspended a cage full of Iraqis whom they claimed to be spies and slowly lowered it into a domestic swimming pool, you could see the diving board in the background, they filmed from several angles the cage going down with the desperate faces of the men, and then, heaven spare me, they had cameras under the water to show them expiring in agony. but without emotion. If you read Dabiq, I'm not suggesting it as a possible newspaper readership for you, but if you read the ISIS magazine Dabiq, they talk of the enslavery of Yazidi and Christian women in cold terms. There's no emotion in it. I was very struck when I went last year into the town of Yabrud, north of Syria. Nusra had been in Yabrud for a year, and the Syrian army, not necessarily through massive heroism, but by using the mobile phones and calling the Nusra people whom they knew, saying, "Get out of town now," the Syrians went in under shell fire, and I got into Yabrud with them. And I went first with a bomb disposal officer, because there were wires everywhere linked up to mines, to the Christian Orthodox church in Yabrud. Now, this church is the oldest in Syria. It still has the remains of Roman columns in the apse. I saw them with my own eyes. What was interesting is that round the outside of the church, in the sort of forecourt, were mosaics of all the Greek Orthodox saints, St. John, St. Peter. And in all of them, Nusra, or ISIS, whichever particular group you favor in this cause, but it was Nusra, had used electric drills to take out the eyes of all the saints in the mosaics. There was one mosaic of St. George and the dragon, and they'd even drilled out the eyes of the poor old dragon. There's a people. What has ISIS got against dragons, I asked myself. But there was something very chilling about the coldness. In one corner, they had piled the Arabic text of the New Testament and caught fire individually to each one. Here is the New Testament from Yabrud Church after Nusra had finished with it. Much more chilling, however, was when I went into, well, the Lady Chapel. I don't know if in the Greek Orthodox Church there's a Lady Chapel, but the church beside the church. They had destroyed all the oil paintings of the Greek saints. Now I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by this. Here is one of the strips of oil painting. There were wires everywhere, and the Syrian soldier with me suggested if I went down the wall and turned right, I might be able to grab a bit of the painting. This is what I found, and I'm going to show it to you now and ask you what you notice about it. This is the painting. You can see the saints' faces, you can see the paint, the gold. I showed this actually at St. James Cathedral in Toronto 2 weeks ago, and the gold shone out. It was the first time it had been back to a church since it left Yabrud. But I noticed it took me a month to realize what this implied. What do you notice? Give me a shout, someone. What do you notice about this bit of painting? Shout it out. Yeah, 2 people have got it, and probably others. It's very straight, isn't it? Nobody slashed at this painting with a knife, crying, "Allahu Akbar." These paintings were fed into a shredder. They used a machine. Someone said, "Put these paintings through the machine." You see, there was no emotion. And I've begun to feel and suspect and think as true that ISIS is not a cult, it's a weapon. It has as much emotion behind it as a ground-to-air missile or a tank. So who's using the weapon? I can never suggest that the Saudi government or Saudi Arabia as a kingdom would ever dream of supporting ISIS, because the last time I did that, I got a letter from a very expensive set of lawyers in London telling me I would be committing libel if I even suggested such a thing. However, we know a lot of the money for ISIS comes from individuals, shall we say, in Saudi Arabia. We know that the institutional sect upon which the constitution of monarchy in Saudi Arabia rests is the Wahhabi faith. Abdul Wahhab of the 18th century and his agreement with the House of Saud in the 18th century that they would rule in the Hijaz. And Abdul Wahhab, who went with his warriors and slaughtered the Shiite occupants of Basra, much like ISIS has been slaughtering the Shiites of Mosul and Raqqa. What happened is that Abdul Wahhab became, in a sense, a kind of venerated saint in Saudi Arabia. It is Abdul Wahhab's teachings and that of the Saudis together which inspired the Taliban, who were blowing up the Buddhas of Bamiyan with the same enthusiasm that ISIS blows up Palmyra and the Roman ruins of Syria. And the Taliban's execution, though not their videotapes, were as professional and ghastly as ISIS. And ISIS's institutional framework is based upon Wahhabism, the very same institutional religious framework of the Saudi kingdom. And this cannot be denied. So we have a strange situation in England right now, ladies and gentlemen. Believe me, we have a prime minister who tonight is urging the British to support the RAF's bombing of ISIS, while only a few weeks ago, the institution which supports ISIS, the religion of Saudi Arabia, was being honored by Mr. Cameron, who lowered the British flag in mourning at the death of the Saudi king. There is a problem here, isn't there? Qatar now is pushing the Nusra group, which it openly supports, as the new moderates in the Middle East. Perhaps these are David Cameron's 70,000 moderates, the head-chopping sectarian group called Nusra, which is actually part of Al-Qaeda. A few months ago, Al Jazeera, which is based in Doha, the Qatari capital, actually interviewed the leader of Al-Nusra, who suggested that he was the moderate whom the world would be looking for. I rather suspect the British are hoping to find some moderates in ISIS. But what is happening? The Qataris are hoping that the West will back the Nusra Al-Qaeda group, perhaps against ISIS, but certainly against Assad. And our nincompoops in London are slowly going along with this. One reason, by the way, why 2 nights ago Nusra surrendered Lebanese soldiers they were holding captive, they had already cut the throats of 4 of them, in return for Islamist prisoners in Lebanon, who included, by the way, the former wife, Saja, of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. Saja's father was a founding member of ISIS, and he was killed by the Syrians. So all these things come together. In the Gulf lies a major clue, but we must not look there. One of the major arms sellers, a man who is trying to get in front of the Americans in selling weapons to Saudi Arabia at the moment, is Monsieur Hollande, the president of France. So he wants to destroy ISIS and at the same time give more weapons to those who are the spiritual foundation of ISIS. Again, something wrong here, isn't there, you see? And this is where I feel that we're not realizing what we're doing in the Middle East because we don't understand, and I rather suspect we don't want to understand. You know, I've spent, as I said, just over 39 years in the Middle East, and I've never found myself before in a situation where I've actually turned to audiences in America and Canada, as I have in the last few weeks, and said, help me, I haven't the slightest idea what I'm seeing. I have a few ideas. I'm going to tell you what I see. But I don't fully comprehend it because it's on such an epic, titanic scale. And I think we are seeing the biggest turning point in the Middle East of the last century, let alone this one. And I think we've got to reaccustom ourselves and to start thinking of the future with much greater perspective and distance and generosity and kindness. And we must see that those refugees who came to us were the biggest defeat that ISIS has suffered since it was created in blood and horror and fear in 2014. So the big question, which I now have to address, and I don't know the answer to it, and maybe you do, but it's a question I've never been able to find an answer to. It doesn't get asked directly to me. It never gets asked directly when I'm talking to Muslims over coffee or in a car or meeting to go to the cinema or at people's dinner or lunch. Although it sits there and in little tiny ways it pops up, and it doesn't come up in conversation with Westerners, even less with Westerners than with Arabs. And the question is this, and I think this lies at the heart of our problem in comprehending ourselves as well as the Middle East, most of whose people are indeed Muslims, Arab Muslims. The Muslims are a people who have kept their faith. Imperfectly, of course, as we all do, but they have kept their faith. They still believe that the Quran is the word of God himself as transmitted through his prophet Muhammad. And they try, as best they can, and they fail sometimes, of course, but they try to ensure that their lives, their family, their future, even their ideas of death are locked onto the idea of God's word. They believe in God. Now, we in the West, I don't think largely we believe in God anymore. I think there aren't many Christians left. Yes, there are. There'll be some with us tonight. There are some in Lebanon. There are some in the Midwest of America. In England, sometimes I still see them creeping into church on Sundays, but there aren't many. Why is it that all the books you can buy, I'm sure it's the same in Flemish and French, it certainly is actually in French and it is in English, they always are Muslims and the West, or Muslims and Europe, or Muslims and non-Muslims. They're never Muslims and Christians, or Muslims and Christendom, which Europe used to call itself a few hundred years ago. So you have this situation, do you not, where the Muslims of the Middle East have kept their faith, and yet they have been dominated and occupied, directly or by proxy, culturally, socially, economically, politically, and militarily, by a people who have lost their faith. Your silence speaks very eloquently to me, because I don't think you know the answer either. And I don't know the answer, but I do suspect that this question has to be asked and lies at the bottom of many feelings of anger and fury and humiliation among us as well as among them. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't come to you, and I haven't come to you tonight to give you answers or to tell you solutions. There are no solutions in the Middle East. Resolutions, perhaps, and they will always be imperfect. But justice? Why can't we have justice? Justice for the Kurds, justice for the Palestinians, justice for the Shiites in Saudi Arabia, justice for the Sunnis who fear, justice for the Israelis, who, remember, the British promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine, not just part of Palestine, justice for the people of the Middle East. But we are not interested in this. We are interested in power and influence, and that is what we want to do. I once asked Kamal Salibi, Protestant, professor of English literature at the American University of Beirut, you know, what happened in the First World War? What did we do wrong? He said, Robert, he's dead now, but I have to imitate him because I do a good imitation of poor Kamal. I said, Robert, you know, in the last days of the Ottoman Empire, they wanted to be like you. They brought steam locomotives, rack and pinion, to go over the mountains of Lebanon. They learned to play the piano. They learned to paint, so you destroyed them. And part of the reason for the First World War was to destroy the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to be like us. For the new Oxford History of the Holy Land, I've been having some fun doing the chapter of Napoleon to the First World War. And I've been looking through my own books of Orientalist paintings, almost all by the French, but by a few Brits as well. And they're all of decaying mosques. One magnificent painting of the 1870s shows a caravan, a pilgrimage going to Mecca, with camels and donkeys and poor old men, blind men walking on foot through the desert. Yet this painting was produced when there were regular steam train services from Cairo to Port Said, when you could travel by rail from Cairo to Aswan, when the industrial side through cotton was being, the industrial side of Egypt's economy, cotton was being set up. We constantly looked for decay because we believed that among those people there was only decay. And that's not true. In the end, those refugees who came to us in Europe had a lesson. They didn't believe in that decay. Whether or not it was our fault, they didn't believe in it. And they wanted to be like us. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your patience tonight.
Nothing much happening on the front.
Is that all right?
Just a tweet from the Sun saying at least 45 Labour MPs will be...
We'll see. We'll see. Okay. Okay, you want to talk to the...
Just
okay, fine, sure. Yeah, please. Go ahead, yeah.